Okay, our last two concepts that we're going to cover in this chapter are biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And those are both used as a ways of assessing the health of an ecosystem. So has it been degraded at all? Biodiversity is a measure of how many species are living in a given area within an ecosystem, and also the abundance of those species, or how many individuals within each species are able to be supported by an ecosystem. Because each species has a unique niche or a unique set of conditions that it needs, the more species, the more number of different species that are able to live in an ecosystem indicates that there are more habitat types and more resources like water and nutrient availability. And the more abundant each species is, indicates that there's enough resources, enough energy, enough nutrients in the ecosystem to sustain large populations. So large populations, the abundance of a species, and also the greater the number of species, means that that ecosystem has greater biodiversity. And that's an indicator that that ecosystem remains healthy. And the decline in global biodiversity, so among all ecosystems within the biosphere, is really one of the major concerns for ecologists. Loss of biodiversity has been caused by habitat loss, the introduction of alien or exotic species from other places, and then also the exploitation or over-exploitation of resources. Those are all things that you guys will read about in chapter 25 as examples of how humans have impacted the environment. When you're looking at biodiversity, we mostly focus on that species richness, the abundance, the number of different species that could exist, and also the number within each population. So that's what we described as kind of classical biodiversity. But we have also been starting to look at other things like genetic diversity. So within each population, is genetic diversity remaining high, which means are those organisms still able to interbreed with one another randomly to ensure that genes are passed evenly through a population. Then also ecosystem diversity. So when you're looking at the biosphere as a whole, are we still seeing prairies? Are we still seeing alpine habitats? So if we start to lose a specific kind of ecosystem or see more of a kind of ecosystem, that's going to change the level of species richness in certain areas. So when we see processes like desertification, where places are becoming more dry and seeing less precipitation and they're becoming more like desert habitats, that means that we're losing whatever was there before and we're reducing our ecosystem diversity. And again, this is just used as a measure to assess the health of an overall ecosystem and how many organisms it's able to support. A second way to assess the health of an ecosystem is whether or not it's performing all of the ecosystem functions associated with it. And ecosystem functions are the capacity of natural processes, so things like nutrient cycling, the water cycle, those kinds of energy transfer, and the components of those ecosystems, their ability to provide goods and services that satisfy human needs either directly or indirectly. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart because when I was researching restoration ecology, these were some of the metrics that I used. I looked specifically at prairies, so I was looking at things like carbon sequestration. That's one example of an ecosystem function that a prairie habitat happened to have been very good at. So taking carbon from the environment, storing it in the soil, one of those mechanisms of storage that we talked about. And then we have disrupted that carbon cycle somewhat by that process of combustion and burning fossil fuels. So having a high number of healthy and functioning prairie habitats, sequestering a lot of carbon would be beneficial to us in using that ecosystem function to mitigate some of those negative impacts. Other examples of ecosystem functions that we have seen include nutrient cycling. So moving nitrogen and moving carbon through the environment, cleaning water, the filtering through the soil. That could happen in any type of ecosystem. Providing food and materials for shelter and fuel. So things that we are taking as a resource from the environment. That's another example of an ecosystem function. And when ecosystem functions decline, then that we can also use that as an indicator that the ecosystem itself is not as healthy as it once was. So hopefully in this chapter we've answered all of those questions. You will be happy to know, maybe, that I am not going to be recording a video lecture for chapter 25. So this is, in fact, the final video lecture that you will watch for this semester. I do have an outline posted for this chapter 24 that you'll complete just like you have done all of the others. But I still want you to read chapter 25. And the thing that I want you to be thinking about as you read that last chapter, which focuses specifically on human impacts, is how your life, your actions personally, things that you have done yourself, may have impacted the environment in which you live. And then we're going to get an opportunity to share some of those observations in a group discussion board on Canvas. One thing that I want to make very, very clear, and we have this tendency to do this, and some of them are negative, but not all of those impacts that we have personally on the environment are negative. There are ways that we participate in natural phenomena, natural nutrient cycling, for example, that are not negative. They are just, it's acknowledging our own use of those cycles. So for example, I participate in the carbon cycle. There's the carbon cycle. There we go. I participate in the carbon cycle simply by breathing. When I'm breathing and I'm expiring, I am releasing carbon dioxide into the environment. So remember that even though many of them are negative, and you're obviously more than welcome to share the ways that humans have impacted the environment negatively on the large scale, remember that we're also focusing on simply the fact that humans as organisms participate in all of these phenomena the same way that all other living things do. That's the really big takeaway from reviewing these cycling processes, is that we are simply a part of those larger systems. Okay, so as you're reading chapter 25, kind of keep that in mind, and then make sure that you visit the discussion board area and respond to that prompt, and then respond to 2 of your other classmates. That's going to be one of our final assignments for the semester. I will also be including for your lab this week a link to a carbon footprint calculator. So you might have to do a little digging and looking for like an energy bill and things like that, because what you're going to be doing is actually putting in some of your own information and looking at how you have, how you might be directly participating in the carbon cycle through your energy consumption and the level and type of transportation that you use and that kind of thing. So you'll get a chance to reflect on that as well. As always, if you have any questions about any of this material, please reach out. Thanks, guys.